This past weekend in Washington, D.C., the far right, white nationalists, they had a failure. They were totally outmaneuvered, outclassed, outorganized, and out-humanitied, of course, by counter-protesters in that city who turned their attempts to replicate the horrors of last year in Charlottesville, Virginia, with a protest that actually turned into something much more analogous or much more in reality, a protesting of the Trump administration's white supremacy, racism, savagery, inhumanity, and cruelty. And a lot of those people who are the harbingers of modern racism, of the 2018 version of ethnically cleansing America, whether in the policy manifestos that come out of the Republican Party or the filth that emerges from internet chat forums and seemingly everywhere else. The wine track version of those people talk about something called Western civilization. In fact, even so-called moderates are constantly talking about the unique gifts of the West. And this rhetoric usually overlaps with being things like, I don't know, classical liberals, or with commitments, often unfortunately fake commitments, to things like free speech and open societies, things that we actually do support here on this show and in a broader humane socialist project. And the reason I say so-called West is because the West, by any rigorous historical, geographic, or intellectual definition, is a fiction. And I say that because the West conceptually, from its foundations, has never been a clear thing. As an example, in antiquity and scholarship for a long time considered Greece to be a part of the East, or what was then called Asiatic, and only very recently has been absorbed inside what we call Europe. Some in Greece that were considered to be important Greek thinkers and philosophers were actually in Libya and other parts of North Africa, as another example of this sort of geographic fluidity of the concept and the sort of disputed nature of what is and is not West. The idea of the West is used to imply that the sort of has been a fixed, static, metaphysical reality that has gone back from Greek times. But we know, even going back to the disputed nature of Greece in the beginning, to the fact that Islamic and Arabic societies were the sort of containers through which Greek philosophy was held at different points in history, as an example, Plato and Aristotle, and those ideas were transmitted and physically contained. We know that the Moors were actually a Moroccan group that stretched their influence all the way as far as Ireland, so that this concept of fixed geographic boundaries is even in antiquity inaccurate. In modern times, West, of course, doesn't include, and didn't include in colonial eras, colonized spaces in Latin America, as an example, which is geographically pretty far west. The United Kingdom and other great empires scoured the world and engaged in colonialism and imperialism in Africa and Asia. It stole resources, administered colonial governments, and disrupted local forms of economy and governance. However, as we know from scholars like Amartya Sen, who's probably my favorite liberal scholar, those concepts by which we are strong and profound supporters of, things like holding power accountable, open exchanges, systems of intellectual rigor and accountability across the society, can actually be found in traditions globally. There was traditions in China for public accountability, traditions in India, in African societies. There was deep sort of cooperative decision-making frameworks. In the modern era, people in Africa and Asia and Latin America respond to colonialism and imperialism, often through Marxist thought, but Marxist thought that grew and transformed in local conditions and made Marxism a genuinely global tradition. Go back and listen to the conversation with Bill Fletcher Jr. on the Black Marxist tradition. So we have three core areas here. One, there's no geographic or historical continuity of the West. The West is an invented concept, and a lot of the people that people would refer to as the sort of founders of the West were, in fact, Libyan, as an example, and Greece was not in Europe conceptually until rather recently. Then we have a global expansion of imperialism and colonialism, where countries in this periphery, literally in the economic periphery, as we've designed our modern world, are subsumed into Western systems and assigned as other, outside of the bounds of history, progress, democracy, science, and accountability. And that was a political project that lives on today through global extraction of resources, Western corporations, World Bank and IMF, and trade agreements that are written to not favor poorer and vulnerable nations. And three, concepts like accountability, like a need to intervene in history to promote democracy, human welfare, and overthrow every type of shackle, whether it be economic or religious, is something that either can be found in traditions traditionally, broadly speaking, with regards to power accountability and public discourse, and specifically in the battles against colonialism and imperialism, systems of thought like Marxism, which people might lazily call Western, were indeed made actual global traditions with Cuban, Vietnamese, South African, and various other variations. The West is a fictitious concept. It's a way of making the world neat, clean, and orderly in a way that doesn't reflect reality, but does give a wine track version of the types of simple categorizations and efforts at supremacy that we are fighting against every step of the way. So whether we are overcoming some jackasses that come to DC and need to be made fools of, or people who do open exchange of ideas, bullshit YouTube videos, question the very concept of the West, because history, geography, and global philosophy don't care about your bigoted fantasy life. Guys, jump in here. Griscom, you're chomping at the bit on this one. Recovered from the injuries. I keep teasing this. I was shocked when I watched this video we're going to play later.
We'll have to save that.
Brutal. It's going to happen right before your economic update, buddy.
I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy that very much.
They are.
My family and loved ones, not so much.
Aww. Aww.
But the concept of the West is one that is pretty funny, because when you start to ask people about which nations are included in the West, and you really start to push them, and they start talking about countries like Australia or South Africa,
right,
you start to become very clear by what they mean by a Western tradition,
right,
which is a white tradition. And I would just add that, especially with this idea in philosophy, it's something that's always really funny when people start talking about Western philosophy, looking at the interventions that places outside of Europe had into what would be quote unquote Western philosophy. To think that someone in England reading, or actually even better, think about somebody in Detroit, Michigan reading Hegel, right, has some kind of more claim to this history of philosophy than somebody in Algeria is pretty hilarious. And
right,
this idea of a kind of uniform Western tradition. I mean, we could talk about Western tradition as Beethoven or I don't know, problematic Wagner, right, something like that. But then
you're a big Wagner fan. Griscom really likes Wagner.
Yeah, we'd be careful with that one. But
loves it.
But it's also KFC and reality television shows, and it's just the continuity between these concepts is so vast that to try to package them into this nice kind of very academic veneer that a lot of people do when they talk about Western culture, Western cultural values, which are under attack, is bullshit. And then just as a final point, you look at things when people the most liberal, the most progressive people, when they talk about Western values, they're meaning liberal capitalist democracy.
Right.
Well, let's look at one of the most Western European nations, Spain, which throughout the last 100 years was basically run under military dictatorship.
Right.
While a nation like Japan had an actual democracy, or South Korea had a democracy.
Yeah, they've transitioned into
those are kind of traditions. It's
particularly South Korea, pretty robust democracy.
And after of course,
society.
to be fair, after of course breaking through a horrible military dictatorship as well. Right. But to try to
with this kind of backing of the United States.
Yeah, of course,
right.
Exactly. So try to make this continuous claim about Western tradition, Western values, Western culture is is really erroneous. erroneous in the first place. So we should be careful about it because it not only it implies a unity, but it implies a fairly dangerous unity of white supremacy, of colonialism and imperialism. Which, at least for me, whenever I use that tradition, Western tradition, that's typically is more what I'm drawing from when I'm talking about in a critical way, talking about the Western tradition.
Substitute super producer Brendan Finn. He's a scholar. He's a very well-read gentleman. He has a thought on many things, usually which he whispers Svengali-like in the background, but he's on mic today on TMBS. Brendan, your thoughts?
Folks, I'm just going to start this off by saying that I am no Matt Leck.
Oh, stop it.
No Leckian insights from me. But I do recall, and I don't want to sidetrack this, so just kill it whenever you want, but I recall Angela Nagel actually pointing out that, like, while we do have to take these Western chauvinists at task and say, like, oh, you guys are basically just dog whistling for white supremacy or something to that extent, racial superiority, there is a series of events that are going to happen where Western cultures are, kind of in, like, going away. And, like, they will be outnumbered. We will become a global community. And the question then becomes, like, how do we remember these histories, these people that aren't going to be here anymore? And the fact of the matter is Western cultures are very bad at maintaining others, cultures or anything of that sort.
Yeah.
So let's see what we can do for ourselves.
I also think that one of the reasons it's so important, I'll just say really briefly, Amartya Sen wrote a book called The Argumentative Indian. And he took to task two arguments in it. One was this thing called the Asian values argument in the 1990s, which were governments like in Singapore and Malaysia. And they would say, look, we cane people and we beat the shit out of you for spitting because we're Confucian. It's our value system. And they made that argument, right? And then there was, definitely the 90s were like the kind of, halcyon age of Clinton and Thomas Friedman and the really like the West figured it out first, but everybody just wants to eat McDonald's and invest in blue chip companies. And that's sort of like the end of history. And what Amartya Sen came along, he said, look, obviously things like specific forms of parliamentary democracy or, specific ways of doing things were definitely like products of 17th, 18th century Europe. But more broadly speaking, the notion that you couldn't find global roots on all continents and in all traditions of ideas of holding power accountable, different types of group decision making. I mean, he even went into like various forms of like early Buddhist communities in India and how there was like relatively democratic decision making after the death of the Buddha. And his point was not to say like it was all the same or that some of it wasn't even necessarily like applicable in the modern age, but to say that like, look, both of these viewpoints are really wrong because one viewpoint is saying that like, it's fixed and static and somebody in Singapore, because it's their culture, right? Like they don't want to be able to speak out against government corruption because it harms social cohesion. And then in the West, or in European United States, like, oh yeah, everybody really totally wants to catch up with how we do things versus just this notion that every human being really does, there is an instinct for freedom, for having accountability. And this also, to me, linked up with Bill Fletcher Jr.'s conversation on Black Marxist tradition and the idea of like these, revolutionary figures in places like Africa saying like, we have to return to history. We've been robbed out of history by things like imperialism and colonialism. And also at this time already, we're not talking about westernization. We're already talking about globalization in the positive sense, which is just ideas and traditions and people cross-pollinating and generating things that make more sense.
Yeah, and it's like, and that's just one more thing to add is that think about that the Paul Robeson video that we watched for our cold open,
which set the stage.
For this conversation. When he says
that's how we do, motherfucker.
When he says, it's like, America's my country and I built this country.
That's right.
And, that's something that's very powerful. And that's also true in the United Kingdom as well and in France. So, like, all these nations, these kind of relationships are very deep. And they're relationships of force and they're relationships of terror. But this kind of way to talk about, these communities that are fading away now that we're all living together. I mean, like, we've been interacting with, like, so much of the world. Like, the entire West has been interacting with so much of the world for so long. To try to talk about it as, like, some moment that's passed is absolutely wrong, and it also erases the majority of history of all of these nations.
I'm picturing like the IDW twerps that sometimes happen upon this show. Just like,
That's wrong. It's factually inaccurate. The West. Ben Shapiro.
Dude,
Why won't Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez debate Ben Shapiro? I'm gonna go masturbate around her now.
that's my IDW fan voice.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
He might be a patron.
Well, if he's a patron, then he's great. Remember, there is a patrons are good rule. on
Being a
this
patron
show.
of the show means that you support the free exchange of ideas.
Yeah,
There
that's
you
true. There's been a handful. There's some patrons who I know disagree on any number of things, but just like the quality level.
Can't argue with that.